South Africa is planning more regulators, and this is a bad idea. That's according to Sean Muller, senior lecturer at the University of Johannesburg, as well as Professor Mike Muller, visiting adjunct professor at Wits University. Now, these academics say regulators have failed to achieve their objectives in both the energy and communication sectors. They also believe the National Energy Regulator, the National Ports Authority, as well as the Independent Communications Authority have been a wasteful use of scarce expert capacity and institutional resources. Professor Mike Muller is in the studio to talk to us about this. Mike, tell us more about why it's a bad idea.
Well, you know, we've looked at the model. There seems to be a sort of very general idea that the way to solve the problem of poorly performing state-owned enterprises and municipalities is to set up an organization that will look at what they do and tell them what they were doing, what they're doing wrong, and then tell them to fix it. And the trouble is there's very little evidence that that actually works in South Africa. And so we've said, look, this model doesn't work very well. What should we do? Should we rather try and get our government organizations working better? You know, we have ministries and departments full of people overseeing these SOEs and these municipalities. Do we really need one more organization, or do we need those the existing government agencies to do their job properly? And the concern is that that question doesn't seem to be being asked. And we're just putting the case to say it does look as though setting up economic regulators really doesn't help us. And, you know, exhibit number 1 in there is, has NERSA really helped to make sure that the electricity sector's prices stay on a stable path, that the performance of the sector is good? I don't think most South Africans would agree with that.
Mike, you know, I actually saw this in the Middle East. You know, people would always be brought in, contractors, to tell you what's wrong, and then they'd bring in more contractors to tell you what those other contractors said was either right or wrong. It almost seems to be a way of stepping away from the blame and the big problem, but looks like you are doing something to address it.
Indeed, and I think that's the concern. You know, should we be rather trying to strengthen the capacity, for instance, in energy, either of the Department of Public Enterprises or in the Department of Energy, build the capacity there to do the job of overseeing? Or are they just trying, because they haven't done that very well, they now want to set up another organization that'll do that job for them? So it's supposed to improve accountability to have a regulator, because now the regulator will say, yes, we think this is good or this is bad. But actually what it does, it dilutes the accountability, because who do we blame? Do we blame the Ministry of Energy for Eskom's problems? Do we blame public enterprises? Do we blame NERSA? And I can think of a few others, you know, who are involved. National Treasury is always involved. And what we need in South Africa at the moment is to be able to point fingers at particular organizations and say, hey, you're being paid, do your job properly. And I'm afraid that the regulator at this phase in our lives seems to be a way of escaping accountability rather than strengthening it.
Okay, so say we do away with the regulator. Do we have the expertise within these SOEs, for example, to be able to identify the hotspots?
We are short of capacity in general, but what we need to do then is to use what we have effectively and efficiently. And it doesn't mean spreading it between 3 or 4 organizations. That means concentrating it into sectors of excellence and making sure they do the job properly. So that was actually what really led us to this conclusion to write a paper which said we are concerned about the reliance on this model. You know, Tito Mboweni's new economic paper, the very controversial one of the things he says, you know, and this is why I don't think it's particularly controversial, it seems like he's just repeated a lot of old hat. We need to set up regulators in transport, for instance, and there's a bill in Parliament to do that. But, you know, the question is, where's the evidence that that's going to help? We actually have, for instance, a passenger rail agency or passenger rail safety regulator. Well, the safety record on our railway is appalling. The regulator being there hasn't really helped. So let's concentrate where we need the capacity and stop proliferating organizations and weakening accountability.
And Mike, who's listening to you?
You know, I think that there is a recognition that the system isn't working very well, and what we are trying to reinforce is the doubts that are beginning to creep in. And I think there's also an understanding that it is a way of escaping accountability, and in those circles which are asking questions about South Africa's performance and saying, what are we doing wrong? I think there is a recognition that this dispersion of accountability is causing problems. I think it's too early to say that people are listening. I think people are recognizing that there's an issue, and our job in this paper was to say there's good reasons to say that this model in 2019 is perhaps not the right one. So the first set of people who must listen are the ones who are passing the transport regulators bill in Parliament. The other set are people who are currently doing reform in the water sector, where there is a question about whether the regulator is the first priority. A lot of people used to say it was. I see that slipping. So I hope that this message is getting through, because quite frankly, we are in a situation where we can't afford to have accountability spread all over the place. We need to be able to hold ministers and their departments accountable. We need to be able to hold SOEs and their boards accountable, and let's focus on that. When everything stabilizes, perhaps, and we want to bring in private sector, which was why regulators were first invented, then we can talk about them. But for the moment, let's make our public organizations work better, and then we can talk about regulators sometime in the future if we decide we need to change.
Okay, Mike Muller, thank you very much.